There was a father named Brian who was playing with his son and his wife. They were having fun because it was about to be Christmas. At the same time, there were two gangsters who clashed in a shootout. The two gangsters passed Brian's house, and unfortunately, in that incident, Brian's son became a victim. Brian's son was hit by their bullets and was shot and killed. Seeing that, Brian was angry and ran as fast as he could after the two gangster cars. On the other hand, the two gangsters were still shooting to paralyze each other. Until finally, the gangster who used the orange car was defeated. Meanwhile, Brian, who saw one of them lose, then took the iron and hid near the alley. Then when the blue car came, Brian smashed the iron against the car's glass. Unfortunately, the attack was unsuccessful. The gangster then chased Brian while shooting Brian. Luckily, Brian was able to dodge their shots. Shortly thereafter, Brian had a problem, where a heavy equipment car appeared in front of him, while behind Brian there was still the gangster's car. Brian, who was confused, then jumped and made the gangster members stabbed by the heavy equipment car, except for the gangster leader. His name was Playa, who was still alive from the accident. Playa, who was upset with Brian, then approached him. He didn't hesitate to shoot his gun at Brian's neck. Fortunately, Brian's wife Saya came to see Brian, who had been shot. Long story short, Brian was rushed to the hospital and had surgery. Brian's wife, who found out that her husband had been shot, was even more frustrated. Moreover, her son had died. After the surgery, Brian was in a coma for several days. Then came a detective named Dennis Vassell to Brian's room. Dennis, who saw Brian in a coma, decided to leave his business card so that Brian could contact Vassell when he woke up. The next day, Brian woke up from his coma. However, Brian's condition was very concerning because he was unable to speak. This was caused by the bullet that Playa had fired into Brian's neck at the time. Brian was required to undergo therapy for several days. After Brian's condition became better, he was allowed to go home. On the way home, Brian became emotional once again because he saw that his surroundings were getting more and more chaotic due to the gangsters' increasingly chaotic behavior. When Brian arrived in front of his house, he remembered about his son who had died. He didn't expect that his son would leave him first. Brian's wife, who saw this, felt sad. She then tried to calm Brian down. Day after day, Brian spent his time drinking alcohol in the storage room behind his house. Meanwhile, Saya, who saw Brian, could only stay in silence because she understood Brian's feelings. One day, when Brian was daydreaming on his terrace, he remembered the death of his son caused by gangsters. Brian was determined to get revenge on the gangster, or otherwise he would just feel down and out. Brian then rushed to clean up the bottles of alcohol that he finished in the storage room because he had to make a plan. In addition, Brian also found the business card of Detective Dennis, who had come to the hospital. Therefore, Brian wanted to meet him at the police station. The next morning, Brian came to the police station to meet Detective Dennis Vassell. However, Brian was told to wait for a while because Detective Vassell was in need. Brian then waited in the detective's room. Brian suddenly saw that there were many photos of gangsters being investigated by Detective Dennis Vassell. At first, Brian just looked at the photos, but when he saw a photo of Playa, he instantly photographed all the gangster photos. After he photographed all the photos, Brian decided to go home and cancel his meeting with Detective Dennis. When Brian got home, he taped up the photos of Playa and the other gangsters because Brian wanted to finish them off. Brian then marked the calendar on December 24th, the one-year anniversary of his son's death. On that date, before Christmas, Brian intended to kill them all. Then in the following month, Brian began to train physically, even though he was still very weak and unfit. Brian also went to a shooting practice range so he could shoot properly. However, none of his shots were on target. Then Brian bought a used car because he realized he would need a car in his action. After he bought the car, he then modified the car. In between modifying the car, Brian learned martial arts by himself from YouTube. On the other hand, Saya, Brian's wife, felt tired of Brian because since their son died, Brian no longer cared about her. The next day, Brian tried out his modified car while practicing his driving skills. However, it seemed that Brian was still struggling, but he kept trying. When Brian returned home, Brian found his wife who wanted to stay at her parents' house because she felt Brian was no longer caring for her. Seeing that, Brian reluctantly let his wife go to her parents' house. Brian just kept quiet because he realized that he had only been focused on his determination to take revenge for his son's death. The scene moves to 10 months after the death of Brian's son. One night, Brian managed to find Playa's headquarters. From a distance, Brian photographed the activities at Playa's headquarters. Brian saw Playa, who was making out with his woman. In addition, Brian saw Playa's right-hand man, who was in charge of running Playa's drug business and handled the finances of his gangster. The following days, Brian participated in shooting practice. Brian became more and more proficient in shooting. There was not even one bullet that missed the target. Then Brian continued to practice his driving skills. By now, Brian looked good at driving his car. Moreover, Brian also continued to train his physique so that his body and fitness were very stable and good. One morning, Brian went shopping at the supermarket. After that, he was about to go home, but he saw Playa and his men around the supermarket. Brian, who really wanted to kill Playa, then intended to stab Playa. But he decided to stop because Brian realized there were a lot of children there. Then Brian wanted to go home, but before he got back to his car, one of Playa's men pulled him over. This made Playa's girlfriend humiliate Brian in front of many people. When Brian got home, he vented his anger by practicing fighting harder. Long story short, on December 23, Brian intended to go to Playa's right-hand man. Brian secretly entered Playa's right-hand man's house. He found the man and Brian managed to paralyze him. Then Brian took him to the storage room of Brian's house. Brian told the man to write down all the crimes he and the gangsters had ever committed. On one occasion, Brian's right hand was able to fight Brian, and there was a fist fight. Luckily, in the end, Brian managed to kill the man. The next day, Brian went to his son's grave. He apologized because he couldn't take good care of the boy, so he died at the hands of the gangsters. After that, Brian visited his in-laws' house to see how his wife was doing. Although Brian could only see Saya from afar, he was happy to know that his wife was doing well. On the evening of December 24, the one-year anniversary of his son's death, Brian prepared to assassinate his son's killer, Playa, and his gangsters. Brian was equipped with a dagger, shotgun, grenade, pistol, and also a bulletproof vest. Meanwhile, at Detective Dennis' house, he was alert because he heard someone coming. He slowly went outside and checked the surroundings, but what he found was Playa's right hand that had been finished off by Brian. Detective Dennis then checked and found a red envelope containing a flash disk. When he saw the contents of the flash disk, he was surprised because in the flash disk he saw photos of the gangsters in his room. Besides that, there was a letter that read, "What you should have done." It ends tonight. It turned out that the one who sent the flash disk and also the letter was Brian. Meanwhile, Brian was looking for the whereabouts of Playa and his men because he would soon kill them all. On the way, Brian saw two of Playa's men who were beating civilians on the side of the road. Brian, who saw that, felt that it was his chance to start the action. Brian planned to finish them off right then and there. Brian waited for a while for the right time to start his action. Then when Playa's two men were about to leave, Brian approached them by hitting one of them. Brian managed to finish off one of Playa's men. Meanwhile, the other tried to attack Brian by climbing the top of Brian's car. Brian, who saw it, then shot him. Eventually, Brian managed to kill him too. An hour later, Brian threw a parcel on top of the building where Playa was located. Then it was found that one of Playa's men who was exercising was on the roof. He got the parcel that Brian threw. He was surprised when he opened the parcel, which turned out to be pieces of the fingers of two of Playa's men that Brian had killed on the road earlier. Then Playa, who thought that it was all the actions of enemy gangsters. Without waiting long, Playa immediately ordered his men to attack the enemy gangsters. Then Playa's men came to the enemy headquarters and fought the enemy gangsters. Meanwhile, Brian was already there and watching them from afar. It was known that Brian deliberately pitted them against each other so that they would finish each other off. Soon Brian saw a policewoman trapped in the battle. Brian, who knew it, felt heartless, so he was forced to intervene to save the woman. Brian bravely fought one by one the gangsters who were there by driving his car while shooting. In the meantime, one of Playa's men recorded Brian's actions there. Then Brian tried to bring the policewoman who was cornered. Unluckily, the policewoman was shot when she was about to get into Brian's car. Not long after that, Brian realized that Playa's men had recorded his action. Without a second thought, Brian crashed into the man. Brian took the man's phone and shot him. After he finished off the man, Brian decided to get out of there. Unfortunately, on the way there were Playa's men who had been following and watching Brian. They'd followed Brian in 2 different cars, but an annoyed Brian managed to easily finish them all off by shooting them from inside his car. Shortly afterward, Brian was faced with one of Playa's men riding a motorcycle. He tried to shoot at Brian from close distance. Brian, who knew about it, tricked him into entering a small alley. Then Brian shot him and made him crash into a pole. Brian then decided to go home. He went home because he had run out of ammunition due to the firefight that had taken place. Brian quickly refilled his ammunition because he would still be back to finish off Playa. But when he was about to do the action again, Brian found out the news from Playa's men's phone that he took. In the message on the phone, Playa told all his men to gather at the headquarters. Furthermore, Playa already knew the identity of Brian and his wife. Brian, who knew that, didn't want his wife to be Playa's target. Then Brian rushed to Playa's headquarters on his motorcycle. After a short journey, Brian managed to arrive at Playa's headquarters. Brian saw Playa's men outside the building. Brian then got off his motorcycle and shot the car that contained Playa's men until it exploded. Later, Brian slowly entered the Playa headquarters building. On the stairs, he saw several of Playa's men who were ready to fight Brian. Luckily, Brian, who practiced for a year, didn't have any difficulty in fighting them. On another side, Playa was dancing with his girlfriend. Playa thought that his many and reliable men were able to finish off Brian, who was alone. Back to Brian, who was fighting dozens of Playa's men. Brian seemed easily able to defeat them all. Brian, who managed to get through all those hundreds of shots, reached the next floor. But before he continued his journey, Brian set a trap bomb first. As he was walking, he saw Playa's big man. The man viciously beat Brian, who looked exhausted. Brian was quite overwhelmed by the man this time. Besides, Brian's unfit condition made him unable to do much against the man. At the same time, some of Playa's men came and were ready to fight Brian. Fortunately, they were hit by a trap bomb that Brian had made, so those who passed through the bomb died instantly. Brian, who heard the explosion, then took advantage of the situation by beating back the big man. However, the man was still strong and was able to make Brian weak again. At the same time, Detective Dennis secretly entered Playa's headquarters. He came to help Brian eliminate Playa and his men. Shortly after that, Detective Dennis had to deal with some of Playa's men. Luckily, he was able to easily fight them all off. Back to Brian, where he struggled against the big man, even though he used his remaining strength. After that, Brian finally met up with Detective Dennis. They then agreed to work together to eliminate Playa and all his men. While they were talking, suddenly a woman attacked them both by shooting at Brian and Detective Dennis. It turned out that the woman who came was Playa's girlfriend. Brian then managed to corner the woman. He firmly pointed his gun at her head, but Playa's girlfriend showed a heavy face and asked Brian for forgiveness. The sight of the woman made him remember his wife, and so Brian slowly lowered his gun. Unfortunately, the woman shot Detective Dennis. Meanwhile, Brian finally managed to kill the woman. However, Detective Dennis suffered a severe gunshot wound. After finished off the woman, Brian continued his walk until Brian arrived at the main room. Brian, with a weak condition, had to deal with Playa there. When Playa shot Brian, he was surprised to see Brian didn't die because Brian was wearing a bulletproof vest. But Playa viciously fought Brian until finally Detective Dennis was able to shoot Playa to helplessness. Brian, who knew that, then took the chance to kill Playa by strangling him to death. After he killed Playa, Brian remembered his son. Brian even hoped that if his son was still alive, then one day Brian would see him graduate. That was Brian's wish, to send his son to a higher education. Sadly, Brian's beloved son had died due to gunfire from gangsters. After Brian's revenge mission was accomplished, he and Detective Dennis felt relieved. The next day, on December 25, Saya, Brian's wife, visited their son's grave. She then found a letter that Brian had purposely left there. In the letter, Brian wrote his apology for ignoring Saya for a year. But now he wanted his wife to come home because his mission of revenge for their son's death had been completed. Brian also hoped to have a child with his wife soon so that their lives would be colored once again.